Hello everyone, you're listening to the podcast of Studios Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute episodes, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I'm Denitsa Marchevska, a postdoctoral researcher at the Public Governance of KU Leuven, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr Julija Sardelić, who is a senior lecturer in political science and international relations at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Her research focuses on topics of citizenship and migration, particularly the position of marginalized migrants and citizens, as well as stateless people. Julija has held various research positions in different universities in Europe, including the University of Edinburgh, University of Liverpool, European University Institute, and our very own KU Leuven. Besides numerous research articles, Julija is also the author of The Fringes of Citizenship, published by Manchester University Press in 2021, and The Refugee Protection Crisis and Self-Serving Diversity Politics in Transit Europe, which has just been published by Springer. Welcome, Julija.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here back in my old institution, KU Leuven, where I worked just before moving to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm delighted to be here with you today for this podcast.
We're very happy to have you. So to just kick us off, your research focuses on the position of marginalized citizens, forced migrants, and stateless persons, and on the refugee protection crisis in Europe. Could you tell us a little bit about what led you to dedicate your research to this topic and how did you become involved with it?
So in my latest book, The Refugee Protection Crisis and Transit Europe, I actually focus a lot in the introduction on positionality and why do I research what I research. I've been born in former Yugoslavia, present-day Slovenia, to parents who were migrants, have faced certain challenges with citizenship when Yugoslavia fell apart, which were resolved because my parents were able to resolve them. But at the same time, I also lived in a region of Slovenia that was quite multicultural. So there was, let's say, Slovenian majority, Hungarian minorities, but also a lot of other minorities in this region, including Croatian, then Serbian, and so on, and especially also Roma minorities that have been always the racialized community. And if the multiculturalism was celebrated, different languages were celebrated, many times Roma have found themselves in the most racialized position. I'm saying this because this also is related to my first book, The Fringes of Citizenship, and also because before I went into academia, I worked for many Romani-led NGOs in the region and with Romani communities to see how to address this unequal multiculturalism that was presented in the region and actually racism that was present towards Roma and still to a certain extent is in Slovenia, unfortunately, although Slovenia is usually celebrated as one of the countries that has better track record with human rights. When it comes to a position of Roma, that is not the case, unfortunately. Because I grew up in former Yugoslavia and have faced challenges with citizenship myself, because I worked in Romani-led NGOs, which I also understand that I have certain position of power and privilege because I did not face same challenges as Roma did, for example. However, coming from the same region, one of the things that I was trying to do in this region was how to actually create a different kind of future. So this is one thing I was working in NGOs, but also realized that NGO work can only go to a certain extent if policies on the upper level don't change. So this led me to also do research on, let's say, the position of marginalized citizens, but even more so on the citizenship itself and migration itself and how different migration positionalities, but also citizenship itself does marginalize certain people, including Roma. So that was my first book about.
So your most recent book, as mentioned, is The Refugee Protection Crisis and Self-Serving Diversity Politics in Transit Europe, and it dives into a lot of these issues that you just touched upon. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about how this book project came to be? What is this Transit Europe that you talk about in the book, and what sparked your interest in this space specifically?
I've worked with Roma who were forced migrants before I started doing this research. But in 2015-16, Slovenia and Croatia and other countries, let's say in Southeast Europe, experienced something what they said they have never experienced before. That is a large movement of refugees going through their territory. And the claim then was that the countries that called themselves transit countries because they said we cannot offer more stable permanent protection to refugees who are coming to Europe during the 2015-16, what I call refugee protection crisis. So they call themselves transit countries, that they are only there to not offer protection, but may get refugees to the place where they would get protection. That was the official narrative. But what I found out, first, if I go to transit countries, that there was a little bit of self-serving prophecy. On one hand, countries like Slovenia and Croatia did not have a lot of asylum applications, and it was said because refugees don't want to stay in Slovenia and Croatia. At the same time, they approved a lot of legislation that actually supported their transit rather than integration in the countries, because they did not want refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq to stay, and they wanted them to continue. So there was a lot of what we would call transit legislation. But what I wanted to do was actually compare 4 different moments in history after the 1951 Convention was accepted, to see how the countries, so it was Austria and former Yugoslav countries, Slovenia, Croatia, and so on, how do they react when they have a larger number of refugees coming? That happened first in 1956, after the Hungarian Revolution, when Austria had 180,000 refugees from Hungary after the Soviet troops crushed the revolution, and Yugoslavia actually accepted in first instance 20,000 refugees. And that was called refugee crisis. Then the second time a term refugee crisis used was in the 1990s, when we had Yugoslavia, and then in 2015 and 16, and then also in 2022 when we had Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In all these cases, the countries in question described themselves as transit countries. Even when it comes to Ukraine, they did not offer actually full refugee status.
Yeah, and this is something that you see parallels with how it was approached in the 20th century as well.
Exactly, yes.
This is very interesting. And of course, as you say, your book focuses largely on a few countries in Central and Southeast Europe, so Austria, Slovenia, Croatia.
Yeah.
But some of the dynamics and the trends that you describe seem to have wider resonance across Central Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, so many countries in the region, including Hungary, Serbia, Bulgaria, to name but a few, have adopted a very hostile approach to asylum seekers, to refugees. A lot of it has been under this transit rhetoric as well. So can you speak a little bit about these trends and the ways that they intersect also with the broader political processes taking place in the region?
I mean, this is a really good point. So one thing that, for example, Slovenia and Croatia claimed in 2015 and 2016 when we had the refugee protection crisis. As I said, I call it refugee protection crisis because it was a crisis of protection rather than the crisis the refugee brought to Europe. But what was interesting about these countries that might have been a little bit different dynamic was, so for example, they did not have similar rhetorics necessarily, for example, as Viktor Orban in Hungary, that was outright, let's say, hostile towards the refugees. What, for example, Slovenia, Croatia, and Austria, to a certain extent, actually said, no, we have solidarity with refugees, we're going to support them with transit and so on, but as long as they go somewhere else. In the end, we saw that it didn't mean that they actually accepted a lot of refugees on a long-term basis. They didn't offer them even temporary protection in 2015-16. And the other thing that I noticed in my book, in 4 moments in history where there were a larger number of refugees, what countries tend to do is avoid giving refugee status. It depends which group of refugees you have. So Ukrainian refugees, for example, got temporary protection, which is not the same as refugee status, which is really, really important to say. At the same time, it is true that, for example, refugees from the global south, such as Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq, did not even get the temporary protection. They got what I call transit migration. But all these are really showing that there is something more general broken in the international refugee protection system. We need to question how much the system is actually done for protection of refugees or how much is done for the benefits of different, especially powerful countries' interests.
Yeah, no, absolutely, which also kind of leads me to something else I wanted to talk to you about. We often hear this discussion about refugees in the context of South and Eastern Europe and Central Eastern Europe, the way that those issues are framed there. And of course, this is the focus of your research. But I was wondering, to what extent is the experience and the attitudes within those states fundamentally different than attitudes and approaches to refugees elsewhere in Europe, especially in the present day? So I'm thinking here, for example, of some of the ongoing debates around asylum policy and asylum policy reform in countries such as United Kingdom, Denmark. The UK announced an overhaul of its asylum policy, which will make refugee status temporary and conditional by design, will revoke some of the support provided to asylum seekers, and will dramatically extend waiting times for permanent resettlement. So to what extent do you see such processes as symptomatic of a wider...
That's a very, very good question. I'm not sure how much I'm competent to answer it based on my research. There has been quite some fantastic research done, for example, research from Piro Regepi and so on, that shows that the policies that happen in Southeast Europe are an extension of broader racial capitalism and colonialism. This is not my research, obviously. This is something what others have done. It's interesting that these courses can be quite different, and there have been some countries in, let's say, Southeast Europe that have been even more hostile towards refugees, and Western Europe had this civilizational gaze towards this country, saying, oh, this is because you're not civilized enough. But at the same time, these are connected, of course, these policies. At the same time, you would see the countries that I wrote about, so Slovenia, Croatia, and so on, that were talking about solidarity, European cooperation, which very quickly fell apart when it wasn't anymore of interest of states. So you can have different rhetorics, but many times you come to the same conclusion, to this international refugee protection system that is very hierarchical, very racialized, will give least protection to negatively racialized refugees from global south especially, however not give stable protection also to, for example, Ukrainian refugees who also have quite precarious statuses in my view. So there's never a question of equality, not just in Europe, but also where I live now, New Zealand, also Australia, had very, very Operation Severin Borders. So, for example, UK is copying some things from Australia, how to outsource refugees. And this is becoming also a pattern. Rather than more protection, it is more securitization of borders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we talked about these issues, it's as you point out yourself, they're so politicized and subject to so much controversy these days. So I was just wondering, as a researcher, what is it like researching topics of migration and refugee protection in the current political climate, where such topics have become so divisive? What is your experience?
It depends which topic exactly and how you do it. I think positionality and reflection on ethical issues are really important. For example, I decided for this book not to interview refugees where their statuses would be very precarious. I did interview representatives of NGOs, international organizations, and so on, just to protect refugees whose statuses might be very precarious. I think the current climate raises a lot of questions, and migration, as you say, it's a very politicized topic. Although if you think about how many people migrate outside their home countries, we would see that it's only 3% of people, and among migrants there are only 1% of refugees. But these are stories that bring big emotions with people, and sometimes debates are not actually based on arguments, but it's based on some imaginary things that it's very difficult to understand. I do have a lot of students who have refugee background, and I try to say, okay, you talk about your lived experience and try to think about theoretical underpinnings of this, because this is something what I think is important for the future of academia. This is something what I really do try to do actively, to give space to others, new generation of researchers. I think that migration will always be divisive. At the same time, it's shown more and more, and this is one of my new projects, that countries even in Southeast Europe need migrants, and there's labor demand for migrants. So my new research is actually looking into this. How do countries that used to be called migrant-sending countries now actually, because of immigration and population decline, have to accept new migrants and do bilateral. I do this with a colleague from University of Ljubljana, Professor Tamara Pavasović-Trošt. We are doing some research on that to see like how countries that were migrant-sending countries are now actually the ones who want to receive migrants, and how does this shift and change the boundaries and belonging and so on. And this is something that's going to be a future debate. On one hand, there is really hostile environment towards, if I use the UK term, towards migrants. At the same time, a lot of these countries are actually dependent on migrants. Mm-hmm. So it's really not a zero-sum game. I think that research on migration is important and does need to break some of these myths.
I completely agree, and I think it's indeed such an important topic. It's great that we have people really looking into it, and your upcoming projects seem just as interesting. So
thank you very much.
I, for one, am very interested to see what comes out of this, and thank you very much for joining today for this conversation. It was great to hear more about your work.
Thank you very much for having me.